Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Paige Walters. I'm president of the Springfield City Club Board of Directors. And we're excited to welcome you here today. We're in the midst of our May election season, and we can really wow.
We only give you one.
Great. We've been really fortunate to be able to cover several of the races and ballot measures that are going to show up this month on your ballot. So everything from our Secretary of State Democratic Forum to our City of Springfield Street Repair Bond. Had it all, and we're here at our new location in Grand Rapids. I'm excited to be able to welcome you guys lunch while you're here. Today, we are covering our Democratic primary House District 7 race. We invited both of you to participate. And Mr. John Lively here is the only one who took us up on our offer to come say hi to you all. So we're here with him today. John, thank you so much for being here, Representative Lively. Since we only have one candidate today, I'm not going to time Mr. Lively and his responses, but I'm going to ask him to keep them short. I do have a number of questions for you, and then we'll at some point give it up to the audience if you've got questions for Mr. Lively as well. So with that, I'm going to let
thank you for allowing me to be here today. So most of you know me from some place over the years, but almost as long as I have. Retired Senator Byron. I got retired. I was calling form of it's retired. I want to talk about 2 or 3 things about the office. First, I'm a true believer that experience counts. So one of the reasons I'm going to be re-elected, I'll be 3rd in seniority in the House of Representatives. You have every 2 years, there's an enormous amount of turnover, and that's not all bad. But the problem is, in many cases, issues take years to evolve and get solutions. And so it's always nice to have some people in the legislature that have some of the experience, and that's something I can bring to the legislature. I'm completing my 12th year with this 12 sessions plus special sessions. So a lot of sessions and many, many legislative days in between. And I can tell you from my perspective, the learning that you get to do through all of that is critically important to understanding and participating in issues. A couple other things I will say, I am a student in the legislature. It's not about what I can do in the House, and I can have the greatest ideas in the world to solve all the problems, but if I can't get other 30 more votes, it doesn't make any difference. So it really becomes about relationships, understanding the issues, and then working with your partners to solve those. Another part of being successful in the legislature is staff. And I'm very fortunate that those that have worked with my office know Andrew Hickerson, who is my chief of staff, ran my first campaign in 2012. And he's still in my office, and that makes a huge difference as a legislator, both from a managing the calendar standpoint, but also issues, because in many cases, he's got as much background on issues as I do. So when we're talking about things, he can recall things that I might not, or bring everything else to bear. And I'm very fortunate that Andrew's been with me. And fortunate from the standpoint of the different things about this. So a couple more things about what I've done since I've been there 12 years. I would believe that there's no other legislator currently in the House that has served on as many different committees as I have. So the Speaker of the House chooses which committees you will serve on. And many members, and I appreciate why they do this, many members have a specific area that they really want to be focused on and do things, and they get on those committees and they keep asking to be reappointed. In many cases, they get reappointed. But remember, not many of them have been there 12 years. My approach has been, well, I would have liked to, before I started on some of those committees. My approach has been, if the speaker asked me to go someplace else and serve on a committee, both, I'm willing to do that. But secondly, there's something else I can learn about, because at the end of the day, we get to vote on all those issues, but many of them don't have any direct involvement with. So I've served on the Veterans Emergency Preparedness Committee, the Economic Development, Small Business, Early Learning, Family Supports, Higher Education, Gambling Regulation, Transportation and Economic Development, Healthcare, and the list goes on and on. I've enjoyed every one of those. And at this stage, having served that long, I think it provides a real different perspective for me when we're debating the issues and understanding, and especially when the issues come to the floor of the House and I have to vote. Not that I don't trust the chairs and committees, I do, but I always like to have a little bit more understanding of what those issues are, and that's provided to me. So I want to make a couple brief comments about the upcoming session. In case I happen to be there, about what the priorities are going to be, and this shouldn't surprise anybody. Almost all sessions, first and foremost, should be the budget. And the reason it should be the budget is because the enormous amount of things that happen in the state, both at the state level, the county level, the city levels, rely on state revenues and state support. So if we collectively in the legislature don't manage that budget correctly, we jeopardize it. I think most people know we made a lot of new investments in the last two sessions. It was great that we could do that, but how we sustain those investments is going to be a real challenge. The projections for the next biennium is flat at best revenues, which means we start off the biennium with a deficit because the roll-up costs for the programs we implement in ongoing programs are going to exceed what the estimated revenues are. So that's never an easy situation to be in, but that's, so that from a standpoint why the budget always has to be a priority and should be. And some of us tend to ask more questions than others do about the budget. But remember, at the end of the day, I don't sit on the budget. So when I get to vote on that, it's next to the last day of the session or the third last day of the session. And by the time, it doesn't mean I don't get to have input like everybody else, but by the time the budget comes out, we've reached agreement across the aisle and people pretty much agree with it and move forward. So the budget's important. Transportation, so funding transportation system, both the state, county, and local levels is going to be a huge matter of discussion in the next session because we're getting further and further behind with being able to maintain our transportation system. And there's no immediate answer. The only immediate answer is we need more revenue, but there's no clear path how to address those issues. A lot of things going on there, but we'll discuss it. Climate and environment will continue to be at the top of our list for a lot of different reasons of why we have to keep addressing that. K through 12 funding. So we believe in the legislature in the last session, we provided a K through 12 package. It was what that's the K through 12 system asked us for. When you start in a session, everybody gets together and they put together the requests and things. And in this particular case, we reached the level that they told us then that they needed to maintain, not necessarily expand, but to maintain K through 12. I'm sure many of you read since then, a lot of the systems are struggling for multiple reasons. But I can tell you, one of the reasons is declining enrollment. Because revenue, what they get paid is based on enrollments, and declining enrollment through the K through 12 is a plus this time. Some more than others, and if they have fewer students, ultimately, regardless of if they get less. But we're gonna look at that, especially the formula of the K through 12 and how we distribute the funds. I'm a big believer we got to do more because we haven't done very much about higher education and student support. Unfortunately, more funding for higher education has been on the agenda since I've been in the legislature. We've not got there, and we're not going to get there if you look at the money that would take in that, but we can do more to help students that are in funding offset other costs in that so they don't have to take on so much debt. We worked on that last time in the higher education committee. We still need to work on that because we didn't get it past the budget committee, but that's another area we need to.
So John, I just want to have a follow-up question on education. What is the role of the legislature in ensuring that we're going to have a robust public school system, both in K-12 through college, outside of funding for institutions?
Well, so the legislature implements or agrees to policy and passes policy. So let's pick on K through 12 first. So curriculum, I can go through the whole list of things that in many cases start at the legislature. We provide policy direction, how many credits, what the credits should be, whether we should add things to it. So Full day kindergarten was something that for years we didn't have in Oregon, came through an effort of the legislature to do that. PE in schools is another example, was eliminated, then they said it put back. So part of the problem, whether it's K through 12 or higher education, is what implications of those policy changes and things the legislature does to their operation. So many would say, both at the higher education K through 12, that we pass a lot of mandates that we don't give them the money in which to implement. And so that's a problem. I can tell you, every year, there's more talk about the credits and what we should get from K through 12 or even through the college level. All of that would require more money than we don't have. Higher education is a little different because the role of the higher education coordinator is a little different, but it's the same thing there. Besides the budget, we oversee the policies and how the direction of it. So, but I think the people here from local communities say we do the same thing at the level for local community. We pass many things that they have to comply with, but we don't necessarily provide the funds in order to do that.
So statewide business advocacy group stated that the regulatory environment is going to be a priority for them going into the 2025 session. So what do you think that the legislature's role is in adjusting changes to our regulatory system? And where do you feel Oregon's done well or fallen short for regulation?
Well, at the end of the day, the legislature passed the rules that then it has to follow within the state. And I don't disagree that there needs to be changes within the regulatory system. So last session and maybe the session before, there was quite a bit of conversation about attaching to the bills that dealt with changing regulations and what the ultimate cost was to the businesses that goes out there. Because in many cases, we have those discussions, but it's not well understood at times. So that's part of what we need to do. But I can tell you, changing regulations and moving things back, there's multiple considerations. And first and foremost has to be safety, whether it's public safety, safety employees or the businesses. But those reviews are going to happen within committees that have worked on those issues over time, but nothing will change quickly. It would be nice. And so 2 years ago, I met with several business groups and I said, so tell me which of the rules, the regulations we have are most problematic, create the most problems for it. And we got very little consensus. So depending on the size of the business, the community you're located in, because up in Multnomah County, and Portland, they have all kinds of additional taxes and rules. So part of it's going to be when we start the session, the business people have identified specific things that can be changed that will impact making the business more profitable from the standpoint, given the issues that are going on. In the short term, we can address those, but if we start off this session just saying that's what we want to do, we're never going to get there, because there's also colleagues that are want to put in bills to do more regulation. There's always an issue from the standpoint, but as whether it's minimum wage, paid family leave, I could go through the list and I understand the costs, the burdens they've placed on businesses. And certainly for a lot of businesses, corporate activity tax is problematic. But the corporate activity tax is based on activity, not on net profits of that. So regardless of whether the company is profitable or not, they have to pay the tax. There have been several efforts in recent sessions. There will be a NIST to change the threshold. Because I think we need to change the threshold in light of small businesses. To change the threshold, the money has to come from someplace else. So that unfortunately are the types of conversations that you have. Move to one place. We're going to move to it.
So let's talk about some of those funding issues as it relates to economic.
A little louder, Paige.
Talk about some of those funding, unfunded mandates or funding of services. Oregon has really made that livability, I'll call it livability and quality of life a priority for our state. And that's everything from funding education and healthcare and fixing homelessness and having public safety be a priority. How do you approach balancing funding those solutions while also supporting business growth in the economy?
So a couple things. One, first, it's ultimate priority. My priorities might be different than others, and it is different in many cases than the legislature. So first, I approach from the standpoint. So I've been involved in small business and economic development for 2 years. And so in many cases, my first approach is what impact will have on businesses and how do we sustain those businesses. then you have to balance that again, and what's the overall that we're trying to achieve, and so I'm, again, go back to, I always ask the questions, both about how do we balance it, but also how do we continue? So the issue with many of those things is, in fact, we have more needs and more great programs that we could do in the state than we'll ever have money for. So then part of it becomes going back to, within the money that we have, how do we best offset? How do we protect businesses who create the jobs and employ people against the needs over here where we have homelessness, we have health problems, huge issues to doing that. And like I say, there's not enough money to do all of that. So I approach it from the standpoint, how to reach the balance. The other thing that people do is that every session there's requests for new programs. And so from my standpoint, if somebody comes in and asks me about my program, the first question I ask them, so where do you want the money to come from? Because the money's gonna have to come from someplace else, you know, it isn't actually there to do those things. Get back to that balance. So personally, that's how I operate. And when I get into the session, you know, I work with my colleagues to say, this doesn't work. I can tell you sometimes in our office meeting, my colleagues get tired of hearing me gripe about the cost we're putting on businesses or even our communities, but that's all I can speak up on their behalf, argue to try to get it.
So you're lucky enough to represent a district that's very fortunate to have a diverse traded sector economy. And many of those largest employers represent traditional industry sectors like manufacturing. How would you at a state level support innovation and technology being utilized in those industries?
So three things. One is just, so a lot of what drives expansion of businesses and access to capital. And depending on the business, what access do they have to capital, and how much they do. So I think that's an important role the state is planning to try to play that role. I think the recent efforts for the semiconductor industry is an example. But another key factor that is employees. So the thing I hear from many people is employees. So the state, along with community colleges, universities, and K-12, just has to do much more to help make sure the workforce is trained and ready to help support. So if they're able to expand and do that. And then the third kind of area, so what is impeding their ability to do that? I've been a strong supporter of your enterprise zones or tax incentives and that to try to offset upfront costs for them to be able to do that, but that's not the only answer. So in the interim, I get to share the climate, energy, and environment needs. And many of the discussions there will be around DEQ and the regulations on businesses. And so I'm going to go back to what standards do they have to meet or not. In some cases, that's an impediment, given the costs to invest in those things. And so there's some of the things you have to go back and just look at all of those things and try to decide how do we best balance those things and help business thrive at the same time not reaching those goals.
How have you engaged with constituents during your time in office? How would you continue to do so?
So that's, it kind of ebbs and flows, frankly, since I've been in office. So early on, when I was in office, I did a lot of coffee, neighborhood studies and that. But over time, either I wore people out or they got wore out. I don't know, but it didn't become very effective. No, people just didn't show up and have those conversations. I do a newsletter that I send out to people. I engage with all the local leaders, whether they be the school board, the park board, the city council, the chamber of commerce. So I continue to engage with those people, and then specific groups that represent others within our community. I try to meet with them. Mostly it's being accessible. Anybody that wants my cell number has it. So you don't have to call my office in Salem, you can call my cell phone. Now, people thought I was nuts when I put that on my business card. But I think it's important to feel that they have immediate access. And very few people call it. Most people call my office and do those things. So it's being sensitive what the issues are and responding to them. The other part of that is constituent services. And I can tell you there isn't anybody in the legislature better than Andrew of doing so, responding to constituents and taking care of the issues they go. It helps us both identify what those issues are, but helps the constituents appreciate other things we do there. A recent example is the employment department. The employment department, unfortunately, has exploded again. They have new technology and that was going to solve the problem. The problem is way understaffed. So right now we're getting multiple requests from constituents because they can't get the employment. Andrew does a tremendous job of working with the department to work through those issues. And think of how many people in the state face that issue. And so there's multiple things. I try to go to events in the community and mix with people and understand what people are. It just, you have to, it changes over time.
Let's talk about land use. We've been, don't be too excited. So, yeah, there's been a lot of conversations in this last year, both from rulemaking bodies and the legislature, around changes in land use policy that our localities are needing to implement. Where do you stand on that? And what do you see this next session coming up as it relates to the decisions that have been made in the
So, I've been one of those persons, so I'm a strong supporter of our land use system. I think there's reasons why we have to be concerned about how we grow and the impacts of doing that. So I strongly support it. But at the same time, the system has never worked the way we thought it would work. And I was involved in 1980 in the city when we implemented the first plan. And the goal was there would be certainty involved in this, and you have these supplies, and it hasn't worked that way. Between the parks, between the fields, between all those things. And that's why, so the process for cities to amend their urban growth boundary, the process is for developers to get certainty, has drugged way out. And slowed the system down, and created all kinds of problems with having enough land that's available. So, and I am one of those that believe that part of the problem right now for housing is we don't have enough available land. But it's not just available land, it's the infrastructure. It's the infrastructure. That people think we could, and the governor has provided some communities the opportunity to amend their plan and bring in a certain amount of land. But the reality is, if we can't service it for 15 years, and that in many cases is what the following is now when you take to service the land. So I think the important thing there, and we're working on it, is go back to the original concept about certain the system works. And I appreciate not everybody agrees to the system, but the system, this is the way it is. This is the process. If you go through that and you have the findings that way, support. I was not supportive in the last session of making some huge exceptions for the semiconductor industry, nor was I supportive necessarily of the governor trying to open up all land use for all the communities, but ultimately they put restrictions on it. They provided a choice to be made local, which I'm fine with. But they're just, there's a balance, but it's a problem. But the infrastructure is just as important as having the land. And we have a real problem in the state, local communities that don't have the resources to be able to keep ahead of the infrastructure any more than the state.
I want to open it up to questions from the audience. If you guys have any, feel free to raise your hand.
Oh.
Thank you. Hopefully it's not a tough question, but I was curious, from your perspective, what you think the biggest issue that the state has, the ability to address in Springfield is?
That's interesting. So I think now, based on what's going on, I think infrastructure, so whether it be sewer streets, I believe. And historically, remember, the state wasn't a big player in those because local communities had resources in which to do those things, property tax or the property tax in Asia. But the amount of resources available because it has not kept up. And so communities are very restricted today. Well, not with that priority. The state just doesn't have a whole bunch of money laying around here that we can do, that we can give cities in that. But I think we have to play a bigger role in helping the cities and county overcome. One of the things I do is serve on the state infrastructure financing authority. And that authority is helping on schools and water and all kinds of infrastructure. But the money available is a very limited amount. So go back to priorities. So we'll pick on the lottery or other things in the state. The legislature decided we want to move infrastructure in our community. And the state's role in that to a much higher position, just put more money into it. The cities and counties still are going to be the primary do it, but if you look at our streets, look at the age of the infrastructure, whether it's water or sewer, there's just lots of needs there. It would help businesses, would help building homes. So for me, that's what we have to. But the state's really just moved into that form in recent years, being a major funder of local infrastructure. Schools are the same way. School districts have a very tough time in building a school because of the cost. If the state wasn't willing to take a part of those costs, there'd be many schools, especially small ones, wouldn't be able to replace the revenue in the area. Not an easy topic again, because it goes back to budget and priorities for the budget. You're gonna have to move monies that are spending someplace else potentially to that. The assumption that the economy's gonna be flat and the budget's gonna be flat. What are the pros and cons of making that decision based on the national economy, based on the kicker, based on how we're going to pass making a election? Is it too conservative or is it too conservative? So, obviously, the state just returned $5.6 billion dollars in the kicker after this last year. Several things happened after COVID, all unexpected from this amount of revenue that the state was spending in the city. And remember, when the state does the projections, they're already doing projections today that we're starting to use for the 25 dividing. So we're doing projections based on where the timeline is today. And when we adopt the budget, the last projection we use is May, so if the budget starts in July of 25, that means the projection we'll use is May of 25, and then it'll be 2 years down the road when we see all the results of that. So first, that's still problematic at how we do that, but that's the budgeting. We have changed the process, and the process is more conservative than it was before. Conservative from the standpoint of the factors. So the legislature, working with the legislative fiscal office, has added additional factors in there to try to refine what those numbers are, so we don't see all of these. But at the end of the day, it's still a guess. Here's a couple things that have happened that are unique. In some cases, unique to Oregon. Our population is decreasing. Our population is decreasing. It's not growing. Why isn't it growing? First, we have a negative birth rate in the state of Oregon. So we're not replacing. Secondly, we have lower in-migration. This state has grown. It's employment based on over years with in-migration. Neither one of those things are adding to the population right now. So at best, our population is flat. So for the next biennium, we have to look at first that. Those projections are current and they're real. That's what's happening in this state. And they're not, presumed they're not gonna change. Well, birth rate's not gonna change. And you know, all the issues about migration of people moving from other states. Oregon's an expensive state to live. It's not an inexpensive, so that adds to the problem of people moving. So we have this issue of slow population growth. We also have the issue, remember, our general fund, that's really tied to the income tax. Again, income taxes revenues exceeded all estimation in the past couple of years, but there's nothing out there for having fewer people working. If things level off in the economy from inflation, if wages reach a more balanced, which is some point they have to, then you're pretty easy to predict, here's the wages as much you're going to get. So that's another factor. And the other is we depend on gambling and alcohol. Those are huge sources for our general fund. And so you know what happens if you decide you're going to substantially grow those, you create all kinds of problems on the other side. So there's a balance there. So while the revenue will grow from the lottery, the revenue will grow from alcohol sales, it'll grow at a much, go back to population, a much slower rate in some cases, but you have to consider the costs on the other side. So I think what we're projecting for the next is the best place to start. The good news is if we get into the biennium and revenues are substantially up, of course, we risk a kicker. And right now, they're thinking there's going to be a kicker, but that's still the risk. But depending on how much that is, it gives us additional money to invest over that time outside of the potential risk of purchase. I don't see anything right now that should change that, what we're looking at over the next biennium. I hope that's what we do.
One of the major accomplishments of the short session is to deal with the impact of Measure 110 and substance abuse issues. Do you expect that the legislature in the 25 session will sort of leave that alone to see what those changes did, or do you expect further tweaking?
So we should leave that alone. But remember, it's an election year. We're gonna have new members in the Senate and the House, and they bring with them questions and remove others. So I'm hoping we'll leave it alone, but here's going to be the issue. Funding to sustain what we put in place to address unemployment is critical, and we don't have enough funding in place right now to build the infrastructure in our communities, the feds, in the position. So that's going to be a discussion. 25 goes back to the budget discussion. not only do we sustain the funding we put in place now, how can we find more funding to do that? The good news, by that time, the local counties and the communities will have implemented on the diversion side, and we'll see how that's working, but I fear it won't happen quick enough. So there's gonna be pressure, there will be measures again brought to the legislature to just get rid of things instead of doing what we did. Okay, that's not working, let's get rid of it. I'm hoping that law enforcement, local communities that are partners in doing this will continue to become about it takes time to do this. I work very closely with the police chief here and others as we were doing this to understand how can we be most support where you're at in your positions and still address what the original intent was of 110. Where was that compromise? And I think we reached it. But there will be efforts in the new session to undo what we did. There will be efforts not to put additional funding into it. That's all part of how the sessions work. The good news is it's a long session. So we'll have from early February till July to hopefully work those out. So we recognize former Senator.
I suppose.
Okay.
He's a member of city.
John, I want to follow up on Lynn's question. It's really a lot of the assumptions of the bills that were passed was that we would direct people to treatment. Yet across the state, we're woefully short on treatment facilities. I guess my question would be, do you think that there was enough money allocated to start those facilities and pay for them on an ongoing basis? And is there a need for more? My guess is we need more.
So there wasn't enough money. So here's the problem with all this thing. So regardless of how much money we put in there, the time to get the money to the communities to start the process is lengthy anyway. You know, the theory was, so we prioritized ready to go projects, shovel-ready projects, they call them, where they're ready to build the beds and stuff. Well, even if they are, we're a year out or more for those beds. So part of the issue, it ultimately wasn't enough money, but I think it was enough money in the short term to start addressing it. But the public isn't gonna see that. All they're gonna hear in the meantime is this isn't working. You're gonna read stories every day of people that can't get treatment or need treatment. You're gonna hear from judges who are working with the local law enforcement that can move people into those, say the same things. Well, I would do that if there's not a bed available, because we're several years out, if invest more, that we could potentially have enough support. But the other side of that, what you hope is some point to reach a kind of happy medium, so the demand starts declining if you're addressing it quicker up front of them. But there's no doubt the next session is gonna have to put more money in, but the key is how long, how long it takes to get the money in the field and to do those. It takes too long.
Seems like everything needs more funding. You know, you're cutting from one program to fund another one, or somehow balancing the budget. But what about new sources of funding? Are you thinking about bake sales or anything like that? New tax, sales tax, what, anything?
Well, I personally might be supportive of sales tax. Is not gonna happen in the state. The citizens are adamant. So it isn't in the near term or any term probably going to be a source of revenue. But there are other discussions about other types of revenue or tweaking revenue streams we have. There are a lot of discussions around transportation because I think, and Lee can correct me, but I think the figure is if we just caught up today and addressed the $1 billion shortfall, it's 80 cents more in gas tax. You think the citizens are going to settle, even though they don't know how much they pay now? But you think the citizens, and certainly the legislature, is going to vote a tax increase of 80 cents per gallon? They're not. So it goes back to it. So it's going to take a combination. That's one where they'll take a combination. And you always know, and the cities know, part of this always goes back to the fees that we charge for services. And so what those permit levels, they go back to businesses. In some cases, it creates a real burden on businesses, but how much we can charge in fees to offset those costs to enforce the rule, those will all be under consideration. The prices of the tags for your automobile registration, all of those are things that are on the table to consider. Those things all are restricted to where they can be spent from a revenue, but that's okay. We have a revenue shortage. But otherwise, you can talk about tweaking income tax. We have one of the highest rates of income tax already in this nation, but you know, those are things, all of that will be discussed, and Representative Nathanson, who chairs the revenue committee, they look at all of those things in conclusion. So that's why it goes back to this whole thing of diminishing the cost. So if we want to diminish what those costs are, I'll pick on the cat tax issue. How do we make up that money? Because it's revenue now we're dependent upon, and that money goes to K through 12. So it's always a balance. There are a lot of things, none of them raise a lot of money. We could argue that we just want to turn the lottery loose. The lottery is charged with maximizing revenues. So we could argue, well, let's just put more machines, put them everywhere. Every corner, have multiple machines and stuff. You could incrementally raise some more lottery dollars, but here's the opposite of that. We have 9 federally recognized tribes in our state that have casinos. And every time we try to attempt to raise a lot more revenue, it takes money from those tribes casinos. They're stuck. The casinos on those things, they don't have multiple locations. So there's a balance there. And the gambling committee that I've chaired and that we've looked at that, there is quickly a lot more money in lottery. But we talked about taxes on soft drinks. I can go through the list of things we talked about. Most of which we never get to the point that we do because the votes do it. Could raise the price and alcohol tax in there. There's people that argue we shouldn't control alcohol like we do in the state, that ought to be private business and we ought to get out of business. That's a lot of revenue to the state. So I don't know of anything, Jim, in the near term that would bring enough revenue. And even if it did, that we could get the votes in the legislature, but there's a very split opinion about raising taxes.
Let me ask a very cynical question. There was a 5.7 billion kicker this time. What would have happened had the legislature sort of held its nose, if you will, and projected a budget that was about 5 billion more than they reasonably thought, and an expenditure of a $5 billion reserve?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And then when the revenue came in, the money ends up in a reserve and the legislature could do something with it next time. That I know is cynical and it's never gonna happen, but why is it?
Well, that's an interesting approach. Again, part of why it wouldn't happen, who would have ever predicted that we would have had a $5.6 billion, especially what we went through with COVID and how things, so then it would be impossible. Now, that's not to suggest that in future revenues, projections in that, you could project more, but here's the risk. If you project more, even if you say it's going to be in reserves, departments in that will expect increases based on spending those reserves. And we'd end up with the limits. Then if they weren't there, we'd have to cut back. So the good news is this state has some of the healthiest reserves of all the states in the United States, and we didn't get there easier. It's been years of dedication from leaders in the legislature to put money into those funds. But now we have lots of money in those funds, whether it be for education, marine, whatever it is. If and when we reach a downturn, we can sustain our services for a certain amount of time. But that's what the risk would be. If the money indeed was going to, they thought it made reserves, we'd be budgeting based on spending those reserves.
So speaking of COVID,
Oh,
and ARPA funds, although they weren't intended to be spent this way, a lot of school districts became dependent on those and we just saw them end this year. How is that gonna change the conversation in the session in 2020?
so a couple of things, and that's right. If you look at certain school districts, why they're in trouble, that's right. They operated on them and now they're out of those funds. So two things are gonna happen. One, the governor and the legislature agreed to do a much better understanding of the school formula, how we distribute funds. And number two, to look at the quality education model, which in theory is the model we try to fund, put enough into it, which we have never done, in closer. But to look at that model and agree collectively, so what makes up the cost in our school system? logically, what makes that up and the sources of that, and where are we falling short? There would be people out now, on my own and say, we're putting too much money in K-12. Look at the results we're getting. We're not getting the results that we should be getting, and in some cases, I agree with them. But the overall, districts fall in different places. So part of the discussion now will have to be, can we agree on what the quality education model or the model should be? And if we agree on that, and if that's $2 billion more or $3 billion more, then we have to agree to how we find those funds. And then the third piece is accountability. We have, the legislature has not done a good job over the years of holding our departments and others accountable for how those monies are spent. So what do we think the outcomes should be? Some districts have done better than other districts. Districts have different challenges than other districts. And so you gotta be careful about the one model thing, because it doesn't necessarily. But there's a lot to understand. Much of that, I think we'll have a clearer picture when the session starts, because the work that's being done now. But I believe what that's going to show us is collectively, we need more money in the system. We're spending record levels in our K-12 system now at the expense of sometimes of higher education. Because we took money from higher education when Measure 5 passed to support K-12, we've never replaced that money in higher education, so we've driven the cost astronomically for higher education. So we'll see, but I think we'll have more of the data on that. Reach an agreement though on what that money might be and how we hold districts accountable is difficult, because we have independent school boards. You have local members, and I respect that. They ought to be able to make decisions and things too. But there's been discussions that that the state ought to set the rate of how much we pay teachers across the board and just make sure we're interested. But that doesn't reflect the differences in communities and school here. So it's going to be a difficult conversation than what happened in Portland, what's happening in some of the other districts, how much folks are short. I just have to tell you, there's some empathy. When I hear people claim that the problem is the legislature didn't give them enough money, I just find it hopeless. We gave them everything they asked for. Now the times have changed, and we don't have the ARPA funds in it, but I can tell you, we changed the process, so we take K-12 and protect it from the very beginning. And say, here's what you want, here's what you get, so we do other things. So the argument today is that the legislature didn't give them enough money, it's what the issues are locally and how they're managing that money, whether it be enough.
Tiffany Monroe, I just joined the Eugene Chamber this week. So I have a question. You opened up sharing how you've had the pleasure of serving on a lot of different committees, giving you a lot of experience. You also mentioned your philosophy and practice of asking really tough questions and taking a moment to pause to say, how is this going to affect, for example, the business community? How is this going to be funded or sustained? I'm curious from your experiences, or maybe issues that you've championed or things that you have seen that you'd like that some of your colleagues have led, how could your constituents within your district, like, for example, or entities like the Springfield City Club or the chambers, what would you like to see from organizations that have reach and access to people with experiences and knowledge? How would you like to see them be a part of educating, whether it's your caucus or others, on specific issues where maybe you're sitting with your staff person, you're like, oh, if only these people I knew could do this to help in the education process. Like, what would you like to see from organizations, entities to help in those really challenging situations where education is required to make the best decision?
So a couple of things. One, all of us need to be involved earlier. So what happens? We in the legislature meet for whatever the time of the session is, and then we go home and things kind of go off. But the problem is, issues and things are percolating during all that time and getting ready. And right now, that's what's happening for 25. So for a lot of the organizations and stuff, and I know we've started to change too, as things change from that. We need to ensure people understand it's important to keep the dialogue going. And in fact, in many cases, it's more important than around the session to get ready for those. The problem comes there isn't any certainty, so people come over time, you need to do this, you want to do that. I don't know what's gonna happen with each other in nomination. And once we get in session, it's too late, the things happen too quick. We can't keep people informed of where the bills are at and how quickly they might change. So first and foremost, we all have to work more to find this way to keep understanding the issues and how they impact. And then where they will be at, because I only serve on 3 committees. And so where like they are, so I can work with the chair or the members of that committee and talk about them ahead of time. An example I'll use is marijuana regulation. So I was not part of the original committee that dealt with once Oregon authorized, legalized marijuana. But I probably introduced more legislation with changing that than anybody else, because it came before the Economic Development Committee, the thing that I chaired, several things. So over the years, I've worked with the industry and try to do things that respond to help them survive. Whether I like marijuana or not is not the point. It's legal in Oregon to do that. And so I've introduced legislation. In the long session, a couple things we were trying to do, there was no committee, and the speaker chose to split the bills up in so many different committees. It just killed everything. The short session, no, there was one bill that came from OLCC and others that I agreed with and worked on, and we were able to get some done. But there's an example we tried multiple times with the industry, they were at the table, they made a lot of changes. I introduced the legislation in the last few cases, I wasn't on the committees. All I could do was lobby just like any of you can lobby. Because that wasn't very successful in convincing them marijuana was a high enough. But here's the key about it, the industry's in trouble. So the taxes in the state, the marijuana are way down. Many of the retail establishments are going to grow. It's a mess, and we should be doing more to help sustain it. I think you read the feds are maybe going to change the classification, or to start changing it. But it kind of goes back to this, and so I really work with those advocates, and we work in sessions and that, and try to find a path forward, got agreement on all parties, but then still, when we get the legislature, I'll pick on Representative Hobie, because it went to his committee last time. Paul and I are good friends, but he said, why would you send me marijuana stuff in my committee? I didn't do it. Speaking of it, but he was right, there wasn't anybody in the committee who had the background or experience with that, so it really got lost. But we just have to understand the process doesn't stop just because we're not in session.
I wanna know what you're working on for next session.
Oh,
Like, what's your big, so what, give us a couple of your real top,
so
yours.
retired Senator Byer can tell you, one of the things I worked on for a decade is road user fees. So we've got to get away from being dependent on fossil fuels tax to fund our infrastructure. And the more we stay dependent on it, the less we spread the cost across our system and how we pay for it. And one of the answers, not the only answer, but one of the answers is the road user fee, which everybody pays their fair share the same on the highway for what they use, which is really what our weight mile tax does now. This is not a weight mile tax. We have the system in place, you know the system works, but it's gonna take years to move to that. One of my arguments, we gotta implement it, and start down that path, we're never gonna get there. The ultimate should replace fossil fuels tax, is the way that we pay for our infrastructure, so that's one of my. Another one of the priorities, since I'm just new chair of the interim on climate and environment. There are several things there. Some of those have to do with DEQ and businesses and understanding the clean air and what we, are all those correct or are they not? Is a different way to pay for it. The priority of mine's always been to do a better job of funding some of those key agencies. We underfund them, whether it be LCDC or DEQ, there's not enough people there. So part of the problem with the enforcement of doing things is we respond slowly. But one of my priorities will continue to be specialist committee to understand those departments that have the most impact on this thing. And what more should we be doing from a standpoint of supporting them, or what we need to change from our expectations? I believe in the goal. So we're back to, since I heard you go, how do we get there or not? I would love to see us in this session resolve the disputes we have over climate friendly economic communities. So I think people know in the last 3 years, I've worked long and hard with our communities, with Springfield, at many, over the implementation of the governor's executive order that implemented the cap and trade, it just implemented the cap, didn't implement the trade size that might have created some things. I agree with communities from the standpoint, there's a key example of one model does not fit all. What large communities have the capacity to do and what smaller communities are very different. So what we've been trying to do, and that's gonna be continue to be one of my priorities, is if the legislation recognize the differences in communities and provide the latitude and financial support so they can get their different ways. But we gotta do a better job. Time is not gonna be there. The challenges are temporary, so that's gonna also be. And then since I served as chair of the board of higher education, we gotta do something to do a better job of supporting students in higher education. That's crazy. I mean, we asked for $6 million in the last session, $6 million out of billions of dollars in budget, just to provide some support for students in colleges out there, food costs, all kinds of things that eat up their budget besides, and we didn't get a dime. But the students do the best job of any group that's ever come before my committee, testifying and having them act together, having the facts, being respectful, and we didn't get it. That's my stand is just unacceptable. So we got to do something.
So related to higher ed, and talking to local college leadership, there are models across the US where having access to shared data helps them make much better decisions for students in K-12, so that they're coming to colleges and universities better prepared, and we're spending less money to get them where they are. That has seemed like such a barrier to getting different schools, different systems on a shared data platform. What can the legislature do to intervene?
So the legislature has intervened in saying that's where we're gonna get. So the last session, we passed a new law that says that's where we're going to get it. You're right. The problem is getting the school districts and the universities to control the system. So part of that goes back to making sure the system is available, the cost to do, and then the head chapter against the community colleges and universities to do that, the Department of Education and local districts have to agree, but you're absolutely correct. That's what it ought to be. And so the other part of that is the goal, part of the goal is all students in Oregon, when they graduate from high school, will already be enrolled in higher education. So they won't have to wait. That doesn't mean they have to go there. This means because we have all the data. They meet the standards. It'll also address financial support. So with that data, we can speed the process up. The students will know what opportunities they have. We've got to get the system, and the legislature is committed to that system. Higher education has, Department of Education still, since I've been in the legislature, I can't tell you the number of education systems that we do. So I complain that we just haven't quite worked it. But that's the model. Other states do it. We ought to be able to get it to everybody. But it's going to take cooperation of a lot of people.
Does that model include community colleges, and its grade schools? We're not missing that.
Oh, no. That's in there. In fact, community college is one of the things that they are moving to from the standpoint of students in community colleges. Is, because there's always been an issue with transferring community college credits to the instance of higher education. But we're still working on those issues, unfortunately, I'm not totally solved. But the status of students coming into community colleges, so they have the best opportunity cases early on to do that. And their look back now is at least to the fifth grade, that we start at that particular level, providing opportunities for students to understand what the opportunities be, what they might need in middle school or even high school, what opportunities they have to go to the community college while they're still in school. Because the majority of students in the state of Oregon go on to higher education, and community colleges where they go. Regardless how much attention our institution employers, the community colleges provide the best opportunity, especially for intermediate skills, but the most costly. So we have to do a better job. But there's another example, we don't do a very good job of funding community colleges. I mean, that raise increased costs. Lots of things we haven't done.
Okay, so what at a policy level could the legislature do to kind of support that gap in between the trade school, community college? And you talk about all education, but also kind of in between, because we also know that there's shortages of people going into those kind of jobs.
There's shortages of faculty, so let's pick on nursing first. We have a huge shortage of nursing. And Lane Community College is well positioned, they're building a new, but they can't get instructors. And the people that instruct in nursing schools are nurses, so we don't have enough nurses already. We're gonna expand the capacity of the school, we're gonna move nurses from where they're working to teach. But it could be several years before the response, so it's just the limit, and so part of that goes back to licensing and how we recognize, and I know these are sensitive topics. But this state has to do more like a lot of states have, that recognizes credentials from other places, quicker, it gets people at least a temporary credential, because there are other people in other states that would love to work here. And we place barriers within the time it takes to get the credentials, and it's not just in nursing, teaching, there's other areas where we've got to get over this, that you even are where you can do it, and we're working on this. But that's certainly from a community college standpoint, it's the credentials, as you know. Lane Community College has authority now to do a bachelor's in nursing, so they now have the opportunity to do that. I think that will help simply because it keeps students at the community college level, and they can get the bachelor's degree at the same time versus having the higher costs. And things at the universities, but that's just all of these things take time to do. But I can tell you, we're fortunate here, because Lane went closely with the school district, and they're really down in the high school level, in some places in the middle school level, curves and doing things. Many students in our high schools here take classes while they're still in high school. And that's great, because that gives them college credit that hopefully will be recognized to the others, provides them a different experience, and that just has to be.
And I appreciate you going for life thing there. My friend experienced that. So what, I mean, is that is that at your level or is that like at the level?
So it's at the legislative level. There've been bills in that area to try to change that, because all of those departments answer to the governor and the legislature. But that's always very controversial. I appreciate people in those fields sometimes feel threatened that we're gonna open this up and people come in who don't have the correct credentials or trained correctly. I mean, it's a balance. When I served on healthcare, we were dealing with that in many of the supports and healthcare. Not enough people, but people had to come to the state and be here a year or two before we recognized the credentials. So the legislature has to say, yes, it's okay to do it. It's not too big a risk, but then we have to make sure the controls are in place to check it and make sure if that's what we're doing. The more of those professionals that are open to that, they all lack people. And that's one of the answers to that. The state often sets those standards and we have boards that oversee.
Okay, we are coming up on the end of our hour together, so, while we've given you an hour to talk, would you like to say a closing word?
Oh, I have pages here, but I won't. So I'll just, again, I'm gonna say, reinforce a couple things. So what you have to appreciate about the legislature is much of the outcomes is not what you see publicly. So much of the outcomes are committees, between committees and what they do, their caucuses. The caucuses meet and talk about the issues. The speaker decides what issues come to the floor. So the public just has to understand, even as an individual member, there's limited influence like an Oakland having all of those particular areas. But here's the key, and what I feel the strongest about it. I know this community, and I know its constituents. I mean, you couldn't talk to a member of my caucus that doesn't get tired of talking about Springfield. And the reason to that, because it has an effect overall where bills end up in many cases. You know, go back to this one model, it doesn't work for them. So many times when a bill starts, it's when everybody in the state has to do it the same way. So if there aren't other legislators saying, wait a minute, that doesn't work for my community, it doesn't work for mine, then you get involved in these discussions and have a caucus or committee bubbles. So what can we do to address this thing? So I feel very strong and a strong voice. I'm not just a voice for Springfield, I'm also a voice for Eastern Oregon where I grew up. People hear a lot about Northeast Oregon, that is where I grew up. So people don't oftentimes appreciate that. I may not like it. In many cases, I don't like it. But you have to weigh not liking the bill over where the long-term policy may get. It doesn't do any good for me to vote no on everything. It's going to pass. So what I should do is understand those things that are probably going to pass that I want to influence and try to moderate or something versus voting no. I could vote no, and pretty soon my caucus wouldn't even recognize me. Who is this guy that always comes in? And I'm not picking on members in the other chamber, that might do that, but the reality is it's relationships, it's respect for each other, it's trust. And that's what you try to build so that you can influence. And my big goal is just influencing things more than I have to have credit for it. So that works best for all the communities. I just happen to go do it much to my wife's disgust.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for bearing with us through birthday party. Being out there. Just kidding.
Not a tractor.
We will be back here in 2 weeks, May 16th. We have House District 12, Representative Conrad has already confirmed participating in our forum. We will see you back here then. Thank